First of all, I want to salute all the new people who are here. It's just amazing. And especially the young people, but not just the young people, because we know that there's so many people who are just so sick and tired of what's going on in this country, of all ages, of all nationalities, of all, gender identities. So I really want to welcome you. It's just great to see all the wonderful faces here, and especially the young people, because you are our future. You're the future of this country and the future, of really realizing a better world, for future generations, rather than this decrepit capitalist system. So with that said, I'm going to talk about J21 and the marches and some of the contradictions, but also some of the optimism that we feel coming out of these demonstrations. I don't think anyone could have imagined the sheer multitude of the numbers that came out for J21. This started out as a Facebook page in Hawaii. This woman who was so angry that Trump won the election, she put out a call for women to march in Washington, D.C. And you can see just from what happened, and I'll give you some of the numbers which are in our paper. It's just mushroomed into massive global marches in close to 700 cities, rivaling those held, and a lot of us remember, the efforts to stop the U.S. war in Iraq on the weekend of February 15th and 16th, 2003, when millions of people came out around the globe. And not since that time have we seen millions of people come out around the world on one single day. 750,000 in Los Angeles, 500,000 in Washington, D.C., 500,000 in New York City, where our coalition marched, 250,000 in Chicago, 150,000 in San Francisco, 150,000 in Boston, and I could go on and on, 100,000 in London. An estimated 4 million people, the vast majority of them women, participated in marches in more than 500 U.S. cities in every single state, on every single continent, including Antarctica, where about 40 people protested against global warming on a ship. I mean, how marvelous was that in Antarctica, where the global warming is really devastating that part of the world. In cities large and small, rural areas, and even more isolated areas, the bourgeois media, with the exception of Fox News, could not ignore the unprecedented magnitude of these global protests. And what sparked those protests, which was Trump, before the Electoral College gave him the election, despite losing the popular vote by almost 3 million, and the day after he took the oath of office. Now, would it have been more impactful if the J21st protest had been combined with the rebellious, militant nature of the J20th protest, as we saw from the video in D.C.? Absolutely, positively, yes. You can make the argument that the entire inauguration of Trump would have been shut down because nothing would have moved with 500,000 people or more in the streets. D.C. would have been shut down for sure. It would have been a nightmare for the repressive state to try to isolate hundreds of militant fighters along with journalists, brutalizing them, arresting them, and making outrageous felony charges that carry 10-year prison sentences and 25,000 fines. Not to have one united demonstration was clearly a lost opportunity for the movement, but not a major setback. It wasn't a major setback because both J20 and J21 helped to take the pulse of a growing sector of the masses who clearly want to fight Trump and go beyond fighting Trump. One of the main contradictions of J21, which was glaring, was the overwhelming social composition of J21 being mainly white women. This is not to gloss over the fact that there was a large presence of Black, Latinx, Asian, Muslim, and indigenous women when you added them all together. And even though there were political signs and placards and banners, of all creative, messages that raised Black Lives Matter, immigrant rights, fighting Islamophobia, in solidarity with Standing Rock, and more, the vast majority of signs were more general in character, speaking disparagingly about Trump and, of course, his degradation of women. And don't get me wrong, many of these slogans were right on target in the areas of fighting patriarchy and sexism. But for women of color, along with lesbians and transgender people, the perception was that in some areas, their presence wasn't always welcomed and embraced, which speaks to the ongoing weakness of the movement, many of whom are still delusional that the Democrats, including Sanders or Chuck Schumer, who was at the J21 march, I saw him, it was awful, are the answer to Trump. In an article that appeared in The Guardian on January 24th, Kianga Yamata Taylor, who's an assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, wrote an insightful piece, and it was called, "Think the Women's March Wasn't Radical Enough? Then do something about it," end quote. And here are some of the highlights on what she wrote. Quote, "The women's marches in Washington, D.C. and around the country were stunning, inspiring, and the first of a million steps that will be needed to build the resistance to Trump. But look around social media and you will read critiques and even denunciations of the marchers. Where were all of these people before? Why are they only getting involved now? Why doesn't the march have more radical demands? Why did march organizers who are politically liberal allow only liberals to speak?" End quote. And all good questions. She continues, "All this is a sign of political immaturity that continues to stunt the growth of the American left. Should the marches have been more multiracial and working class? Yes. But you are not a serious organizer if that's where your answer to the question ends. The issue for the left is how we get from where we are today to where we want to be in terms of making our marchers blacker, browner, and more working class," end quote. Taylor is acknowledging the criticisms of these marches, especially where women of color are concerned, but also acknowledges that the role of the left and revolutionary forces is to help radicalize and politicize women, regardless of their social status. Because for the most part, women want to resist and fight, but many do not see or fully understand the intersectionality between sexism and where other oppressions connect that women of color or lesbian and trans women face, where racism and homophobia and transphobia are concerned. And these oppressions are rooted in the violence, the bigotry, and marginalization of the capitalist state, the police, the courts, the jails, and more. When I was first becoming political, in the late 60s and 70s, the furthest thing from my mind was the women's movement. And I was emerging because of the civil rights movement. But why was that? Because none of these women looked like me. So naturally, as someone who grew up in the segregated South, racism was my number one concern, and therefore I felt alienated from this movement. The main orientation of the women's movement at that time, which was dominated ideologically and with bourgeois and petty bourgeois, ideas during that time, did not connect women's oppression with fighting racism and LGBTQ oppression, the weapons used by the ruling class to divide the working class. But the party taught me that you can both be part of a larger movement, have political differences with that movement, but at the same time help to move that movement more to the left by interjecting a more revolutionary, inclusive program that embraces the most oppressed. It is always about building class unity within our class by recognizing that not everyone is equal in our class under capitalism. And this program includes bringing in the economic issues of not only reproductive justice, but also the attacks on health care and education, housing, child care, low-wage jobs, rape culture, war and racism, and much more, which impact women in deep and profound ways, both here and worldwide. And that's what those marches on J21 showed. So while many of us can relate to the frustrations and anger that many of women of color have expressed about the social composition of the J21 marches, nothing ever stays the same where the struggle is concerned. I only have to think of my own political journey of feeling so alienated by this movement as a teenager to today being a member of a women's coalition that demands no war on women at home and abroad, that every issue is a woman's issue, and unite to fight for women's liberation. It shows that consciousness can be changed only if you're in the struggle. And it's all because of the party's perspective of showing in theory and in practice that women's oppression is rooted in class oppression, along with white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, bigotry against people with disabilities, and other forms of inequality to keep the masses divided and subjugated, to keep the ruling class in power. If the left doesn't engage with the aim of contending for leadership and influence in our class, we just concede these forces to Democrats and liberals, who will certainly try to confine the new upsurge of opposition to the political limits they want to define. The point isn't to bury our arguments. If we want to win people to more radical politics, we must learn how to make our arguments while operating in political arenas that aren't just our own. Revolutionary socialists have a long and rich tradition of building united fronts, which seems now more real than ever, that 3 million or 4 million people are in the streets. And that comes from Ms. Taylor. I'm going to try to skip along here. There's an inspirational saying coming out of the Chinese Revolution that says women hold up half of the sky. But I really think in reality women hold up more than half of the sky, as we saw in J21. As we're meeting, the Democratic Party is still stunned that it lost the election. It's hoping that the J21 marches will help consolidate and or win more women into their camp. And as revolutionaries, as socialists, we cannot allow that to happen, because the Democratic Party is just the flip side of the same coin of the Republican Party. They're both parties of big business and war, and are the death knell for people of color, women, LGBTQ people, and many more. What the J21 marches showed is that the potential of women, many of them who are new to radical politics, can be won over to an independent revolutionary perspective. And I'll end with this. How will that happen? Only if they make a commitment to remain in the struggle, and if we reach out to them in the struggle. If they're exposed to those who have been in the struggle for years and even decades, especially of people of color. This situation is very reminiscent of the Occupy Wall Street movement, when thousands of young people, mainly white, targeted Wall Street, targeted the 1%, because they saw no future in capitalism. This was a wholly progressive development, but there were also contradictions that led to its demise. The biggest being underestimating state repression. And also many of these young white activists alienated people of color. And we cannot allow this to happen, and and really to the credit of so many people who came out of the Occupy movement, they have now joined forces with Black Lives Matter. You know, that shows the consciousness that, you know, that builds. We should seek out every opportunity to build a united front against Trump and all that Trump represents, not just the individual. Take International Working Women's Day. Born out of the socialist movement over a century ago, it could be a very important vehicle that we can use to unite women and women's allies who are already won over to socialism or are open to socialism into the struggle. And the general theme can be something like, women unite against Trump, let's fight for socialism. This is something Workers' World Party can help initiate in other cities around the country and the world with a program of demands. So, again, so many of us were excited to be at J21 in DC, in New York City and elsewhere, not only because so many women felt empowered, but also they want to continue to go beyond J21 to resist and fight back. This is the new wave of feminism, and we must take it to another level beyond J21. Because J21 showed the great potential of women being won over to an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, pro-socialist perspective, as long as they remain in the struggle, engaged in the struggle, and do not get swept up only into electoral politics. And that will be a major task of our party in the coming weeks, months, and as long as it takes to realize a thoroughgoing revolution in the United States, which Trump is helping to accelerate. On International Women's Day, on to building a united front, on to the revolution. Thank you.